I'm Linda Hirsch.
I'm Jim Carney, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education.
The school environment seems crucial to student success. Disruptive students can make learning difficult for everyone. Dealing with issues pertaining to student discipline is an ongoing topic. Schools have relied on punitive measures such as detention, suspension, expulsion, and even police intervention. A new approach, known as restorative justice, has been receiving attention as a better method of coping with student conflict. Today, two educators who use restorative justice practices in their schools join me to discuss their experiences.
Later on in the program, I'll visit an unusual high school in Queens and see how they've adapted restorative justice in their school. But we begin with Linda and her guests in the studio.
My guests today are Nicole Riley and Tyler Brewster. Ms. Riley is Dean and teacher at the Edward A. Reynolds Westside High School. She is also a member of Teachers Unite, and she is involved in efforts to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Tyler Brewster is the Restorative Practices Coordinator at the James Baldwin School in Chelsea. She is a math teacher, and she served as a Dean of Student Discipline at the School for Democracy and Leadership in Brooklyn. Welcome to EdCast, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Let's begin with a definition of restorative justice. What is it?
What isn't restorative justice? I like to look at it as a philosophy that involves the entire community when discussing how to repair harm. I think more traditional methods usually exclude the offender from that process, and a lot of the focus is placed on the victim, whereas restorative justice brings all stakeholders to the table to come up with a solution together about how they can repair the harm that was done to the community.
Some people are calling it the key to school discipline reform. Why?
I think because it's doing the real teaching and learning that educators are supposed to do. So I think if we look at brain research, and we know teenagers, we were all teenagers, they're supposed to challenge and question and make mistakes. Their brains are still developing. And yet we've had this idea of when they do something wrong, we just kick them out. We don't teach them how to change their behavior or how to deal with their emotions or how to solve conflicts in a peaceful way. And so when you look at restorative justice and practices, that's really the key to reforming discipline.
So do you think in some sense with the previous approaches like suspension and expulsion and even calling in the police, have we been criminalizing student behaviors in ways that you think we should not have been doing?
Absolutely. Removing a student from the school community isn't an effective way of helping to teach them to correct their behaviors. Normally, in my experience as a dean, what I found with students who were repeatedly being suspended, they didn't have the space to learn how to correct their behaviors because they were being removed from the community so frequently. So if we want to teach students like how to be productive members of our community, the best way to do that is to pull them in and get other members from the community to give input on how we can make the situation better.
So what would restorative justice look like when it's trying to handle a disciplinary problem?
It depends on the situation.
Yeah. Okay.
But oftentimes what you would see is if the conflict is between an adult and the students, or it could be a conflict between two students, you would see in my school first, we would separate the students, and often I take them, my first step is to walk them to a social worker or speak to them myself and figure out what's really going on, what happened. You would find out both sides of the story, and depending on the situation, you would either maybe have a mediation between the two parties, or if it was if it was a larger group, you might do something called a restorative circle, where you have a conversation with many of the stakeholders or supporters of the student, and then oftentimes there might be some kind of, and then you come up with how are you going to repair the harm. So sometimes it might be doing something for the community, depending on the two people, something they might do to rebuild their relationship. Maybe it's the student sees a social worker once a week. There's different. One of the tricky things about this is there's no cookie cutter answer.
Who handles the mediation or the circles? Who does that? The students, the teacher?
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think at every school it looks different, and as Nicole was saying, it depends on the situation. For example, at my school, this summer we're going to be working to train some students to lead low-level circles or low-stakes circles. Teachers have also been to Morningside training, so they are prepared to run circles. As a restorative practices coordinator, I'm usually responsible for coordinating those circles. So I think it really depends on the situation, the students that are involved. I think what's really important is that the person running the circle has been trained in proper circle protocols, and or if it's a mediation, making sure that it's the right people in the room to mediate the problem, and prepping both sides before bringing them into a room so that you can come to a productive end.
You've used two phrases I want to go back to. And one is this idea of being in the circle, and the other is repairing the harm. And those are catching my ear. So let's go revisit a little bit. When you talk about the circle, again, what happens? I mean, people have all kinds of notions, I guess, of what happens in a circle based from many things that they know about. But tell us a little bit about what happens in the circle.
Well, it's magical, of course. It's actually kind of exactly what it sounds like. You're seated in a circle. We like to have it so that no one is blocked, so there wouldn't be a table or you wouldn't be allowed to text.
Interesting, okay.
And the reason why I really like running circles is because it puts everyone on the same playing field. Myself as a facilitator, a teacher, if they're in the circle, students. We've done circles with parents, school secretaries, any community member can be in the circle, and the idea is that we all we're coming for the same reason, to solve the problem, and no one person is more important than the other.
And I just want to add one key piece to the circle. This is something that comes from indigenous practices, and you often use a talking piece, and so the democracy is spread through the group. So when you have the talking piece, you have a chance to speak, and then when you
mean
don't,
something that you hold and that you pass around? Yep. Okay.
Yep. And so when you have it, you have a chance to speak, and then when you don't, even if it's someone who you have a choice in that moment, either you're going to speak or you're just going to listen. And of course, you can break the talking piece and have a conversation, but often it's a way of bringing democracy to the group, because it's not just the loudest person getting to speak all the time, and it really does give everybody an opportunity to contribute.
And I think another important thing is it slows the conversation down. I think a lot of times we're listening just to wait for our chance to speak, whereas if you have to wait for the talking piece to come around, it really encourages you to listen actually deeply to what people are saying and really be thoughtful about what you're going to say, because there's so much time before the talking piece comes back around to you.
Actually seems like it's not easy for students, actually. It seems like they have to do quite a bit of work. Now, the repairing the harm notion, where does that come from, and what do you try and do when you talk about repairing the harm?
When you have a community or a group of people, I mean, first you have to have something to repair. So there's a lot of community building that goes into this as well. But it's just about how do you fix the problem, or how do you make it so that both parties can come together again and be able to, even if they're not going to be best friends, be able to live and work in the community. And so it's how do we make it better? How do we fix it?
I know that for many parents, obviously a school environment that's not disruptive is really important. I sometimes think it's one of the main appeals of charter schools, frankly, that they suspend students more readily, or and they are able to maintain a quieter environment. How well does this work with students who may be very disruptive or even exhibit violent behavior? First of all, do you ever suspend a student in a school that uses restorative justice?
Yes.
You do?
You can.
So tell us a little bit about how students learn to do what seems kind of difficult, actually.
What I want to say first is that restorative justice isn't a magic trick, in the sense that even if a school decides to implement restorative practices, you're not going to see an all of a sudden drop in negative or unwanted behaviors. It's more of a philosophy in the way you see your colleagues and your students and your teachers, and the way we interact with one another. There are times when a student must be suspended, or we like to think of it as a break from the school community, but the important thing is making it a meaningful suspension. So at my school, we make sure that we're constantly in contact with the student. We might invite them in to meet with a social worker. Mediations may happen during that time period, or if they're going to do a site visit for something that's related to the issue that resulted in the suspension in the first place.
Why do you both think it's so important that we change the way we've been handling disruptions in the schools?
Because, like you said earlier, we're criminalizing kids for being kids. Unfortunately, I guess it's been in the late 90s, there's this idea of no tolerance. And so every time a kid would make a bad decision, oftentimes, take off your hat could turn into an arrest, because we have school safety agents that are really NYPD. And I think, and really when you look at the statistics, it's disproportionately Black and Latino students and students with IEPs, or students that are identify as gay or queer, are the ones that are being suspended at a higher rate, despite the fact that their white peers are doing the same behaviors. And I really think it's a crucial time where we are able to really teach students how to interact in a community and how to solve their problems in a nonviolent way.
Something that you would think they can even take outside of the school environment.
Absolutely.
When they become, for all of us, frankly. How do you see the connection of school discipline and the school to prison pipeline? I know there's a real concern about that.
Well, to me, the most blatant connection is if a student is suspended, they're missing class time. And if you're missing class time, then you can't pass your classes. You don't pass your classes, you don't graduate. What are your options if you don't graduate? It's also creating a very hostile, I think, interaction between students and figures of authority that then they take into their own communities or their own neighborhoods, which usually results in some type of trouble. So,
and escalation.
And escalation. And so I think the root of restorative practices is just conversation and community. And sometimes just talking to another person, you get to understand their perspective. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, sometimes when misbehavior or infractions happen in school, and just speaking to the student who's consistently doing these bad behaviors, if you can have a conversation and see where they're coming from, you can more easily redirect their path.
Jim Carney had the opportunity to visit a school in Flushing that has been using restorative practices, so let's take a look.
Flushing International High School in Queens only accepts non-English speaking students who've been in this country for less than 4 years. As a result, its 400-plus student body is one of the most diverse in the nation. School social worker Tanya Romero has worked on the development of the Restorative Justice Project at the school.
At our school, we have over 24 languages spoken and about 45 different countries represented. Our two largest immigrant groups come from China and from different parts of Latin America. We can have a classroom that's, you have Catholic students, Muslim students, where you have, Buddhists, or you have atheists, you have a whole combination. So I think it's navigating that the first few years is challenging for our students. So we will have a lot of those cultural clashes. And so a lot of the work becomes about, creating, again, environments where young people can form those cultural, cross-cultural relationships.
Well, given the nature of the population, the student population here at Flushing International, it seems that this school is a good school to use this type of approach.
I think that restorative justice is not just a more productive approach, it's a more humane and just approach. And when we think of young people of color, which is pretty much all of our students here, recent immigrant students, and we think about history, right, in this country, and even history back in our countries, in Latin America and China. I mean, oppression is part of, and colonization is part of the history of our people. And I'm specifically thinking people of color, nations, right? And so punitive approaches, to me, is an extension of that, of the violence that has been lived through history, through colonization, through exploitation of nations, of et cetera. And the way that shows up in this country is that we have disproportionate numbers. When in the school system, when we look at who gets suspended the most, who gets pushed out of schools the most, and end up in being criminalized, are young people of color, specifically Black and Latino young men, young people with special needs, right, who are in special education, and also recent immigrant students. So those populations end up being punished at higher rates, at disproportionate rates than their white counterparts. And so in that sense, restorative justice becomes a more just and humane approach, because we're not just punishing young people who are already at higher risks of being pushed out of schools, but it really creates an opportunity to connect, to hear their stories, to respect them, to honor them, and at the same time, hold them accountable from a place of love and a place of integrity, right?
How exactly have you been involved in restorative justice here at Flushing International?
Well, first of all, I think all of the teachers are involved in restorative justice because we've taken it on as a philosophy of the school in terms of working with students, but also just as a whole staff community. But mine specifically, I was trained in the restorative justice approaches.
Given the diverse nature of the students here at Flushing International, does restorative justice work as a way of maintaining order at the school?
I think it kind of speaks to that issue of wanting to maintain order is kind of the more traditional way of seeing things. And for us, it's about how to look at really relationships as the foundation of creating a strong community and building upon those relationships.
And very simply, does it work?
I think we would find that it's a process, and it definitely, in my opinion, works more than a punitive system in that I think I've seen with my own students, it's created a greater sense of awareness for them of who they are, what they want, how they can interact with the adults in their community better. So I think it's helped to facilitate a lot of a greater sense of self-awareness for students and primarily students who have greater challenges kind of navigating school, navigating authority. I think it allows them the space and the time and the place to really think through some of those things. So in that sense, I think it's worked in that it's provided more opportunities for learning for students who often find themselves getting into trouble.
So I think one story that I can share where restorative justice was successful is a time where we had a young man. It was actually during a period where we were having a lot of tension between Chinese and Latino students. And this one young man who happened to be Latino stole money from 2 Chinese girls. We soon discovered that one of the young women was going to use that money to pay for her college application that day, which she couldn't do. So it had a huge impact on her life. When we started talking to the young man, we discovered that he was in a very desperate situation. He had stolen money because he had been arrested a few months before for doing graffiti. So he was living in fear for a few months. On top of the fact that he was undocumented, he had a lot of fears about that, about even like the future, his future in this country, whether he was going to be able to stay or get deported. And he had not shared this with anybody. So all of that story came to light as we sat down and talked about what had happened. And it was a beautiful moment because as he shared in his vulnerability, the young women were very moved and actually forgave him. And they actually offered him support, said, we can support you. If you would have told us you needed this money, we could have supported you. He returned the money eventually. And that year we actually had a huge community forum because we were having a lot of tension between these two groups. And one of the things that they committed to doing was to speak at this community forum as friends. They came on stage and shared about their friendship and shared about some of the challenges they had experienced and how they had been able to resolve that through peaceful dialogue. So it was a very moving moment. And again, none of that would have happened if we would have just punished this young man and sent him to suspension for days.
And now, back to Linda and her guests in the studio.
What is your takeaway from watching this?
I think that they're right on. What they're doing there is what we're trying to do at Westside and is really in the spirit of restorative practices and restorative justice. And I think that is the idea of building community. And one thing that I've learned is also the more community building you can do and build the relationships, that helps. It's almost preventative. Like it helps so that you don't have as many instances and people do feel safe and comfortable and like learning can occur.
What was your reaction, Hal?
I agree. I think she was spot on with everything that was said in the video. Just talking about restorative justice, I think sometimes people have this illusion that it's very soft or just very free form, but it's actually very structured and even more structured, I'd say, than a punitive model where if a kid does something wrong, I can just sign a suspension letter and send them on their way. Like there are a lot of protocols that need to be in place. Everyone needs to be trained. So to me, it's more meaningful than a punitive system. And as she said in the video, that moment would have been missed between those two students if he had just been suspended and sent home. No one would have known the story from either side, and I think it would be a missed opportunity for both parties.
You had mentioned earlier that it's not magic.
It's not.
So I want to ask each of you, how do we know that this is a successful approach? Where do we see that it's successful?
I think you can look at the data from Los Angeles. Here in New York, they've just adopted it into the discipline code, although we're still awaiting funding for that, but there's some new things in the discipline code that point to that. Just looking at the data, it's something that they've even done in the criminal justice system in some states.
So tell me a little about, what does the data tell us?
The data tells us that when students are actually, when the harm is repaired and when they aren't then the school is safer. There's more of a community. They learn how to have a different approach to whatever their behavior is. If it's a student that's angry or acting out, they learn strategies on how to deal with that so it doesn't reoccur. And it also shows that students graduate at a higher level because, like we said before, as soon as they're suspended, oftentimes what I've seen in my career is they're suspended and then they lose it. Like they get so far behind, they're already behind, and then that's it.
What kinds of support do schools need if they're going to implement these practices?
Funding.
Funding, okay. Funding for what?
Funding for the training, funding for the personnel in schools to be able to do the work, connections with community-based organizations for some of the social work and mental health aspects that come along with it, funding for community building events, because restorative justice isn't only about discipline, it's also about, we keep saying this, but it's about building community and trusting relationships between stakeholders within a school. So having the funding to do a basketball game or to order pizzas for the softball team, or just to have that space to be able to do the work.
And yeah, I would say space and time, and people that are, like we said, trained.
And committed.
And I think also the staff needs to experience it to be bought in.
Yeah.
You both alluded to some people have been criticizing this approach. I know that Eva Moskowitz of the Success Academy Charter School Network has said that students need discipline, not dialogue. What's your response to people who think this is a soft approach?
I'm going to say this first. Yeah. Oftentimes, the kids will say it's harder for someone to sit down, especially if they're not used to that or they've never had to do it before, to actually sit down and face and talk. And oftentimes, the kids will say, "Miss, just suspend me. I'm not going to sit down." They would rather be suspended, right? And so there's no real learning in that. And so what I would say to Eva Moskowitz is, yes, is every kid has value and worth. And I think of myself and my friends and my family who would have never graduated high school if we were treated the way we treat students now when they make mistakes. And we all have worth, and kids need to learn. And you don't teach them by kicking them out. That just makes the problem worse when they come back.
Exactly. And it's confusing for me because I wonder where the word discipline became synonymous with like punishment and we forget that discipline can also mean to teach or to learn, as you were saying. And so through these conversations, that's how they learn to be productive members of their school community. And it's important to hear everyone's story and to understand everyone's perspective because it matters. Whether they're on the right side or the wrong side, we have to teach students and honor their existence and their experiences that got them to the point that maybe they made the mistakes, but let's have a conversation about how I can get you back on the right track and show you how to do the right thing.
Is there an experience at either one of your schools that you would want to share with us and just tell us about a time when you feel this approach worked really well?
I can think about a time where it clicked for me that the punitive model wasn't
What was that aha moment?
As a dean at my old school, there was a student who just went through cycles and cycles and cycles of suspensions, principal suspensions, superintendent suspensions. And he was returning to us from his last superintendent suspension. And I pulled him into my office to have a conversation, and I could tell he was already over me. And this time it was different because I actually asked him, like, how are you feeling? And, like, I apologized for the negative relationship we'd had in the past, and it opened a brand new door. And from not to say he was perfect, and again, because this is not a magic trick, but it at least gave him the space to feel like, oh, I am wanted in school. And what he told me, it stuck with me, and it carries me through the work that I do. He said, I was used to being treated like a problem, so I acted like one. And a 15-year-old saying that to me, it all clicked in that moment. Like, kicking a student out or constantly pushing them away, that's the experiences that they have in so many other places in their lives where they're taught and told that they don't matter. So how can you come to school I'm promising you a safe space and then I'm denying you access? And so that really changed my view and philosophy on, dealing with students and how to teach them to do things the right way.
For educators watching who are thinking this might be something I want to try at my school, there is some DOE support for this, yes? The Department of Education is funding some. There are funding some of it?
They did last year. This year, not as much.
Not as much. What needs to be in place at a school, both physically, mentally, to implement restorative justice practices? Can any school just tomorrow say, let's do it?
No.
I think it's a process. Well, I would say you were asking if a teacher's thinking I would like to do this. I would say one thing is to look for support, and Teachers Unite is an organization that offers a lot of support and even a toolkit and resources on how to start. I would say start by you need to find people that are like-minded and that are interested in the work, and then it's a slower process depending on the administration too, if the administrators are on board or not. But I would just say start by educating yourself and reaching out to other people, because there's a lot of different ways you can go with it.
Have you used this conflict resolution among staff members as well, administrators and teachers and that group? Yes?
Yes.
Was it effective?
I think so. I think it's important, especially if a school is going to try to be doing this work, the staff needs to go through the experience. It can't just be something that we plan over the summer and we just roll out to the
Experience it yourself.
Yeah, so I would say even the first year of any school making this transformation, a lot of the focus should be on staff members and parents, and maybe teaching students about it before you develop protocols and systems that you're just going to put in place. Because without the understanding and the heart behind it, it's just another top-down model of discipline. And so I think a lot of the work comes from here when we're talking about restorative justice, and not just what we put pen to paper.
A perfect conclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole Riley and Tyler Brewster. This has been a very provocative conversation with a lot to think about. So thank you both so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, you're welcome. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites.
According to U.S. News and World Report, few 8th graders know much about U.S. history, civics, or geography. Not 1 in 5 scored at or above proficiency level in these areas in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. These scores are unchanged from 2010, the last time the test was administered. Educators view knowledge about these subjects as essential to a healthy democracy. Some blame standardized testing with its focus on English and math for the poor results.
A new report from the left-leaning Economic Policy Institute says the academic performance of disadvantaged students would be improved by focusing on factors outside of the classroom. The paper focuses on 5 conditions which inhibit student success: parenting practices in low-income households, single parenthood, irregular work schedules of parents in low-wage jobs, poor access to health care, and exposure to lead. The researchers maintain schools and teachers cannot fix these problems, and that they must be addressed so the children can enter school ready to learn.
According to a Pew Research Hispanic Trends report, an overwhelming majority of Hispanics say it is important that future generations of Hispanics living in the United States speak Spanish. The survey also found that nearly 90% of respondents believe that Hispanic immigrants must learn English to succeed in the United States.
Education Week reports that a California high school teacher, Dana Dusbieber, blogged that teaching Shakespeare is unnecessary and maintains a European-centric focus on literature. She recommends that students study a diverse collection of works, such as African oral stories and translations from Central and South American authors who do represent more of the student population. Has Shakespeare become irrelevant? Should students focus on literature that reflects their experience and backgrounds? Write us at cunyedcast@gmail.com. We'll share your responses.
Alas, poor Shakespeare, I knew him well. Well, maybe not in future generations. We'll see.
We'll see. I'd like to know what people think.
Yep. Let us know. Well, that does it for this edition of EdCast.
Till next time, class dismissed.